Master, Grandmaster, Sifu, Laoshi, teacher, instructor, coach. This vlog is going to be about some of the different titles that you may encounter in relation to Qigong. So people who know me well, maybe have spent some time around me and had some conversations with me, will probably know that I'm not really a big fan of titles, particularly when they're used as honorifics. I think that can sometimes lead to issues. It's not always the healthiest thing, but sometimes titles have a role, particularly when they're used in a more descriptive way. Sometimes there's value in that. And so a couple of things came up just over the last little while that made me think, hey, maybe a vlog about some of the different titles that you may encounter in relationship to Qigong might be useful. So yeah, people can understand more what they really refer to, maybe some of the nuance of the context around them. And so I'll tell you what those two things were. So one was that someone just recently, they asked me if they could call me Sifu. And this is something I get asked from time to time. And I'll get into more details about that and the meaning of that term later. The other thing that happened was, and it was actually a few weeks ago, but it's taken me a while to get around to sort of doing anything about it. But when I was at a committee meeting for one of the professional associations that I'm involved with, I got a nice surprise where I was presented with this certificate. And so this certificate is recognizing me as a Master of Medical Qigong, and it's from the World Academic Society of Medical Qigong. And so it's a pretty cool honor. I wasn't expecting this. It was just a surprise. It's not something I applied for or anything like that. Just out of the blue, I was at this meeting and like, oh, we've got a certificate for you. It's like, oh, really? So that was really nice. But you see in there's this title, Master, and that's one that you'll see probably a fair bit bandied about by people in the world of Qigong. So these sort of things, yeah, came up and I thought, hey, maybe let's have a talk about different titles. So we'll start with some of the Chinese terms that you might come across. So one common one is Sifu, or if it's said in more of a southern dialect, it might sound more like Shifu. If you've watched Kung Fu Panda, you know, be familiar with the character. There was a character called Shifu in there. So this is a title that is quite commonly used more in the world of martial arts for a master or a well-respected teacher. Now, as I said, it is more used in the world of martial arts, but because there is a connection between Qigong and the martial arts, sometimes the same terminology drifts over into Qigong as well. So what does the term Sifu mean? Maybe a little bit confusingly, there are actually two different ways of writing Sifu, and they're both pronounced the same way. So the start of the word stays the same, Si, which basically means someone who is skilled. The Fu part, there's two different ways of writing it. One, it basically means instructor or someone who teaches, a tutor. So a skilled teacher, a skilled tutor, Sifu. That's not a bad term, skilled teacher. The other way of writing this term for the Fu has a character that has more of a meaning like father. And so it's like, skilled father. A little bit of a different context there. And both of these are used, and again, it can be a bit confusing because they're pronounced the same way, but they're spelt quite differently. Well, in terms of Chinese characters, they're spelt differently. In terms of English transliteration, they're spelt the same way as well. And there's a little bit of a different meaning there. It's quite common within the martial arts, particularly going back into older schools, that there was this, there was a lot of secrecy around the martial arts. and so often different styles were only passed down within a family. And so a term like Sifu, referring to a teacher as their father, well, literally often they were their father. And so that made a lot of sense. But then even within different styles or schools that did expand out and didn't necessarily teach just within their own family, they taught a bit more widely, there was still often this familiar sort of aspect to how they viewed the relationships between teachers, students, and even different students within an organization. And so you had the Sifu was like being a father to the students, bringing them into the martial arts family and sharing the family knowledge with them. You also then had like a Qigong, which is like a grandfather, skilled grandfather, or in other terms you might say Grandmaster, so master and Grandmaster. And those familiar relationships, spread right out, and there are actually different terms for all sorts of different relationships between different people in that school. So you've got an older brother or a younger brother and an older sister or a younger sister. And that's just referring to someone who started training sooner than you or later than you. And then different terms for someone who's like your uncle. So that would be one of your Sifu, your father's contemporaries, one of the ones who studied with the Grandmaster, the master's master, along with him. And so there's often that connection as well. So really interesting, all of these family relationships, each with their own title. And I think in many ways there's something quite nice about that, considering the people you train with as being like a family. Unfortunately, sometimes that also leads to some unhealthy aspects as well, where there gets this almost possessiveness within a system, within a school, and so on. It's kind of like, well, you can only have one Sifu. You can't go and have another skilled teacher because you can't have more than one father, right? This sort of attitude, and where within this hierarchy, because a tendency for that to become very hierarchical, where it wasn't just about teaching, but also having a say and almost control over other aspects of your life as well. So an interesting piece of cultural background in terms of how that term sort of, some of the context around that term. And both healthy and nice parts of it, and some parts that become or can become unhealthy as well. And certainly, I've had a lot to do with different people in the martial arts world and so on over the years, from many different schools. And I've heard firsthand and secondhand many different instances where these relationships became quite unhealthy, quite controlling, quite possessive, and not really the sort of highest ideals we'd want to live up to. And so, from that perspective, the term Sifu can be good, can be bad, depends on the context. If you're using the version which is just skilled teacher, that can be quite nice. When you're adding that implication of father or master as in a certain amount of, like, almost master as in charge of, has control over you sort of thing, I think often that's not so healthy, certainly in our modern age. But anyway, so it's a term that can go either way. Another term that you might hear sometimes is Laoshi. Now, that term more specifically just means teacher. I guess a little bit more specifically than that, it means a highly esteemed teacher. So it's generally reserved for a teacher who's quite senior, very experienced. And this is a term that is probably a bit more common in the world of Qigong, but you'll see it in the world of martial arts, of Kung Fu as well, particularly in China, where certainly in some circles in China, they've sort of recognized maybe some of the shortcomings of the idea of, your teacher being your father and grandfather and, all of this sort of thing, and wanting to establish more of like, hey, this is an esteemed teacher, but they're not in charge of you. They're not responsible for you. Well, their role is just to teach, and to share things with you to the best of their ability. And so Laoshi, I quite like that term as well. So those are some of the common Chinese terms that you might come across. These translate over into English generally as, so Sifu would generally translate as master. And again, Grandmaster would be for, Qigong, the master's master. So there's some quite specific meanings to this often as well, if you really want to understand what they mean. So a master in many ways can be just someone who is skilled at an art. They've mastered the art. And in that context, I think, well, that's not such a bad term. I think where it becomes problematic sometimes is, again, where it's used more as an honorific, like, I'm a master, therefore I'm better than you. And unfortunately, often it gets used that way. But if you're using it in a more descriptive way, it's like, yep, someone who has mastered something, they're good at it. Yeah, that's not so bad. And similarly, Grandmaster. So Grandmaster generally has a specific meaning. So it either means, again, the master of a master, so a teacher's teacher. That's can be an appropriate use of the term Grandmaster. Or beyond that, it often refers to someone who is the head of a style or a school. So they are the person who's in charge of that style and school, and so the responsibility goes to them. And then, below them there might be a variety of different masters who are all involved with teaching and practicing that art, but there's someone in charge. They're the Grandmaster, kind of like in a Western school setting, like the headmaster is the one who's in charge of the school overall. He kind of is in charge of all of the teachers and saying what needs to happen and so on. So again, in that context, as a descriptive thing, like describing, hey, this person's in charge of the school or the style overall, yeah, that can make a lot of sense. Unfortunately, again, all too often people use it as an honorific, as a way to say, hey, I'm better than you because I'm a Grandmaster, and that's, yeah, I don't think that's quite so healthy. So moving on, some of the other terms that you might see in English, there's simpler ones that you can use. So instructor, just someone who's teaching. That's often a pretty good term, I think. Teacher, Qigong teacher, that's pretty good. Maybe even something like Qigong coach, someone who's not necessarily just teaching, but helping to guide and fine-tune someone's practice, working with someone's energy. Moving into other areas, so not just the teaching of Qigong, you could have Qigong practitioner. Now this sort of bridges, because a Qigong practitioner could be someone who's teaching, but it might also be someone who's using their Qigong skill in another way, most commonly for healing. And similar to that, you could use terms like Qigong healer, or just practitioner is probably good, yeah, as a term for that. So there's all these different terms that you may come across. Sometimes people will put a hierarchy amongst these terms as well, which I think for the most part isn't really necessary, but they do anyway. Sometimes people would consider an instructor to be sort of lower level, and then a teacher to be a higher level, because they're sharing a great, an instructor is maybe teaching at a certain level, but when you're using the term teacher, this means a higher level of knowledge and experience and wisdom to pass on. I think often these terms can really be used quite interchangeably though. So, what's my view on all of these different titles? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not really a fan of their use as an honorific. But as descriptive terms, I think there can be merit in that. Similarly, I've had a lot to do with different professional associations and organizations over the years. And, sometimes I've served as a secretary, or I've served as a registrar, or as a vice president, or as a chairperson, or something like that. And these are all titles, but they're titles describing a role. They're a descriptive title. Because I'm a registrar, doesn't mean I'm always a registrar. It doesn't mean I'm better than anyone else, but it means that I have a certain role to fulfill. So if anyone is, like, okay, who do I need to see about, whatever question they might have, it might be, oh, you need to talk to the registrar. You need to send them an email, or you need to talk to the chairperson, because they'll organize what needs to be organized. They make perfect sense to have titles like that. And some of these other titles that we use in terms of Qigong or Kung Fu, yeah, they make sense in that, that sort of way as well. If someone's using the term master as in who's in charge here, you know, maybe in charge of a class or something, yeah, that's fine. They're just wanting to know who's in charge, who they can talk to about something. But similarly, you could just use a term like Qigong teacher to describe that as well. So, you know, normally if someone asks me, you know, because this happens from time to time, and they say, well, what can I call you? How should I refer to you? Most commonly I'll say, you can call me John. If you want to be a little bit more familiar, you can, or sorry, a little bit more formal, you might add my last name. You could call me John Munro. If someone wants to describe me as something, I'll say, well, you can describe me as a Qigong teacher, because that's what I do. Cool. You know, nice, simple and descriptive. Sometimes there's a role, I think, even for myself, of some other titles, and I don't mind sometimes if someone else wants to call me a title of some sort, as long as it's accurate, as long as it's not misleading anyone and it's not just derogatory or anything like that. So, you know, sometimes people want to call me Sifu, and again, if that's in the context of, you know, skilled teacher rather than sort of father in charge of them, okay, you want to call me Sifu, that's fine. But for the most part, I like to, you know, keep things simple and descriptive. All right, so coming back to, so what do I think of this certificate that I was given then, and this title, Master of Medical Qigong? Well, I think it's pretty cool. Like, it was a really nice surprise. As I mentioned, it wasn't something that I applied for or was expecting. It was just a surprise. And really nice to get that, just that recognition from such a prestigious organization, the World Academic Society of Medical Qigong, which is based in Beijing. You know, just really nice. Do I expect people to call me master now? No, definitely not. I didn't before, and I still don't now. But why? Why was I given this certificate? There was actually a specific reason why, and for that purpose, it's like, yeah, this makes sense too. And the reason I was given it was, I mean, yes, a recognition of my level of knowledge and skill, yeah, absolutely. But it was also particularly because in my role that I have with some of these professional bodies, I end up talking to the public. I end up speaking to the media sometimes as well, and sometimes needing to clarify things, clarify misunderstandings about Qigong and so on, and particularly sometimes about things that some unscrupulous people might be doing, or the impression that they may have given about different things to do with Qigong. And so it was decided, without me knowing, that, hey, it would be a good idea to give me a certificate to make it official, so that when I'm talking to, you know, different organizations, different people, a sort of a stamp of approval to say, yep, he knows what he's talking about, you know, we basically, that I have their backing to be able to speak about these sorts of matters with some authority, to, you know, in the best interests of Qigong and the Qigong community as a whole. So anyway, that was the reason, and so and that's, well, that's nice too, to have sort of that mark of recognition and support in a way for some of the things that sometimes I'm involved with. So anyway, maybe that was interesting. Maybe it's just a little, I don't know, a little side thing, but sometimes people are curious about these things. Some of the titles you come across, what they mean, also maybe why I'm not always particularly comfortable with different titles that people might want to refer to me by, you know. Yeah, like I've said, if it's descriptive, I'm generally happy with that. If it's honorific, I'm not generally so keen on that. But yeah, hopefully that was interesting. If you've liked the vlog, please like, comment, subscribe, share, all those good things. Maybe I'll have a less dry topic for the next one.